I'll show you a small example that is already worked out in the textbook to get a better understanding of Amdahl's law. Just give me a second, I'll share the screen. So this is that example where they want the processor used for web subbing to be enhanced, and after that the new processor is 10 times faster on computation in the web serving application than the original processor. So the speed up that they have achieved is almost a factor of 10. Assuming that the original processor is busy with computation 40% of the time and it is waiting for IO for 60% of the time, what is the overall speed up gained by this enhancement? So we can do that enhancement only when the system is in computation mode but not in waiting mode. So how much amount of time can you actually apply this enhancement mode is only 40% of the time can you apply this enhancement mode. So the fraction enhanced will be your from the total time it is 40%. So 40 by 100 will be 0.4 and the speed up that you have gained is 10.
10.
So your overall speed up is if you look here, your overall speed up will be execution time old by execution time new. So if you look here, execution time old will be
Okay.
old execution time will be 1, and when it comes to sorry, they have directly calculated speed of overall, where the speed of overall will be 1 by 1 minus fraction enhanced plus fraction enhanced by speed up. We know the amount of time that we can enhance, the fraction of time that we can enhance is 0.4 and the speed up that we have achieved is 10 times. So it is 1 by 1 minus fraction enhanced, 1 minus 0.4 will be 0.6 plus fraction enhanced by speed up. Speed up is 10. So you are gaining a speed up of 1.56 times than the original than the original mode. Without enhancement, the speed up that you have gained is by a factor of 1.56 times. So there are a few more exercises given at the end of the textbook. We'll just see after this one more topic, the processor performance equation. So when it comes to the processor performance, all the computers that are constructed, they all are run on a clock at a constant rate. And how do you identify that discrete time event? People call it with different names. We call it as clock ticks, clock periods, clock cycles, clocks, ticks, and all. And when it comes to referring the time of a clock period, computer designers generally they refer it with respect to the duration, say 1 nanosecond, 1 millisecond or so, or by the clock rate, 1 gigahertz, 1 megahertz sort of. And the CPU time that is taken for a given program, what is the time, CPU time for a given program can be expressed in one of these two ways. One is how many clock cycles does the program take into the clock cycle time? What is the clock cycle time for each cycle? Or the other way is that the clock cycle time is the inverse of clock rate. You call it as total CPU clock cycles for a program by clock rate. So when you want to look at on an average the number of clock cycles per instruction, you look at the total clock cycles for the program by the total number of instructions. We call it as the instruction count. So the CPU clock cycles for a program is equal to CPI into the instruction count. From this equation itself, if you want to see this CPU clock cycles for a program, how many clock cycles are there for a program, it is the instruction count into clock cycles per instruction. So this is the total CPU clock cycles for a program. Now I want CPU time. CPU time is CPU clock cycles for a program into clock cycle time. So CPU clock cycles is CPI into IC. that is clock cycles per instruction into instruction count into clock cycle time. Clock cycle time is what is the time duration of every clock cycle of your program or of your system. So if you expand each of them, instruction count is the total number of instructions that you have per program. CPI stands for the number of clock cycles per instruction, and clock cycle time is the amount of time, say, for example, number of seconds per one single cycle. So that gives you your CPU time, which is measured in basically the execution time, generally measured in seconds. So for a given program, how many seconds does it take for the execution of a CPU time? And your processor performance is dependent on these three parameters: instruction count, clock cycle time, or the other thing that we take into consideration is clock cycle rate, or the thing, and then the number of clock cycles per instruction. We try to, if you want to improve the performance of a processor, improving any one among these three will improve the processor performance in a direct proportional manner. 10% improvement in any of them leads to 10% improvement in your overall CPU time. But however, all these technologies are not isolated. They are so interrelated that it is very difficult to improve just one single technology. If you look at clock cycle time, it is the number of ticks that happens per cycle, which is dependent on both your computer organization as well as the hardware distance, hardware technology that is used. And when you look at CPI, number of clock cycles per instruction, it depends on what the instruction set architecture that the architect chooses, which will be discussing from the next class, as well as the organization. And instruction count, how many instructions are there per program, is again dependent on instruction set architecture as well as your compiler technology. So these are other few convenient forms of the equation where we are trying to calculate your overall CPU time, where compared to the previous slide, it is only that we are referring to with n number of instructions or n number of uh, instructions per program. The first one is CPU clock cycles. Is we have anyhow seen that CPU clock cycles is equal, the number of clock cycles in a program is equal to CPI into IC. Just to make it more formal, we have used it as we referred it in terms of I is equal to 1 to n, where we refer to the total number of programs that we are using, the total number of instructions that are there per program. Okay, and then there are a few pitfalls when Amdahl's law seems to be so promising, because for every given program we can try to enhance certain portion of the thing, and we can improve the overall performance of the system in such a there are pitfalls that the complete of the system. Tesla will be quite encouraging in the beginning. You try to improve certain fraction of portion of your entire execution time, and it gives you better results. But if you try to extend it throughout the thing, too much effort, it will finally collapse and give you disappointing results. The other pitfall is that a single point of failure, one component failure completely brings down the whole system. That is the reason, after this Amdahl's law observation has been there, whenever we are building fault tolerant systems, they came up with this, the rule of thumb where every system is redundant, so that one single point of failure will not bring down the whole system. And fault detection can lower availability. This was seen in previous cases where the system is able to detect the faults, but there is no mechanism to correct them. So as a result, that respective component or that respective program will be crashing, which will be affecting again the availability of the particular component. of the system. And then uh, these are a few things which we just need to remember being a computer architect, that the cost of the processor is one which dominates the cost of the system, and the benchmarks do not remain valid forever. They have been updates from time to time, and whenever you are referring to, or whenever you are comparing your performance to a particular benchmark, you need to see that you consider the latest benchmarks that are there available in at that point of time. And the third thing, the rated mean time to failure is almost 140 years. So this practically never fail. Although this is a statement given, generally manufacturers do it for marketing strategies, but do this never fail within 40 years. But it is based on the assumption that when you are using it in a system and the system do not fail for 140 years, based on the assumption that the lifetime of a disk is say some 5 years or 7 years, and you keep on replacing it. But in such a scenario only, that is a lifetime of a system. And the last fallacy is peak performance tracks observed performance. Peak performances are those performances where you can truly assure that the system, that is the maximum amount of performance that you can get from a system, and that is definitely not that is not going to be a general normal performance, or the observed performance is what we call. So that is that performance which is at the maximum, and you are sure that your system cannot cross that, but that in general will not be your observed performance. And also your peak performance varies from 5% to 58%. So the gap is so large that it is generally not so useful in predicting the normal performance of any system. So uh, that completes chapter 1, and here are a few questions from for assignment of chapter 1. I'll also open a discussion forum in chapter 1 in the Moodle server, where you can post the questions. And
Actually, they can create for themselves a forum for the assignment also.
the students can create one forum.
Yeah, I mean, like, see, we encourage you to discuss with each other and do the assignment, but certainly not copy answers from each other and give it to us. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think I used to do this with your PM also. Discussion is perfectly okay. Copying is absolutely no. I just want to add a couple of points to what ma'am has been talking about in chapter 1, because she talked about scalability and fault tolerance and reliability and all that. Some terms from industry which I feel you should be familiar with. There is something called N:1 redundancy versus 1:1 redundancy. Okay. So just now ma'am said that, fault tolerance is achieved through redundancy. So there are two models of redundancy. 1:1 redundancy, where for every component you have an extra component. So if you have, in fact, that's what they do with the servers. They, the power unit will basically, every server machine has two power units. If one power unit fails, the other power unit takes over. The reason is servers have to be on all the time, right? So then they assume that by the time the other unit fails, you would have replaced this faulty unit. Okay, that's what is called 1:1 redundancy. Obviously, that's very costly if you want to replicate every component, to be fail-safe. So they have another model called N:1 redundancy, where you have n modules of the same type. Then they add one extra module. The assumption here again, if you go, when you read your textbook, the first chapter and do the exercises, one of the assumptions which is always made is that only one component will fail at a time. Okay. So if more than one component fails simultaneously, then the reliability of the system goes down drastically. But typically, since practically that doesn't happen, they look for N:1 redundancy, where there are n identical components, then I'll add one extra component. So if one of those n components fails, this extra component takes over and they'll replace the faulty component. So that reduces the cost of the system while making it fault tolerant. So that is if in the industry people ask you what is N:1, 1:1 redundancy, N:1 redundancy, you should be familiar with those terms. Similarly, they'll talk about Phi-9 reliability, which is 99.999% of the time the system is available without error. Okay. Typically, network routers require 6-9 reliability. So they are not supposed to fail at all. Then there is the concept of scalability that ma'am talked about. There are again two models of scalability there. One is called the vertical scalability, where that's the IBM model. So if you buy a IBM PowerPC server, okay, what they call the power server. In fact, the power server is 2 crore rupees cost. The last time I found out, I was completely shocked when I heard that. So supposing you say that the processors in the PowerPC, power server are not sufficient for the workload that you have. What does IBM do? IBM will simply add one more processor into the mix, right? I mean, they'll upgrade your server by adding one more processor card or add a new motherboard, remove the old motherboard, which has more processors. In fact, I don't know if any of you have upgraded your RAM in your laptops. You can do that, right? Because there are extra slots available for RAM. You can insert a new RAM card and enhance the amount of RAM in your system. So this is called vertical scalability. The problem with that is that you can only scale so far. And it's also costly because IBM charges a lot. And then if you ask them to upgrade the system, it becomes very costly. So what does Google do? Google does all these things which are cheap and kill all the other companies in the world. So Google does what is called horizontal scaling. What did Google do? It decided when it started its huge data centers that it will not buy all these the branded servers. Okay. Instead, it simply went and bought used servers which are on the market cheaply, put them all together, and if one system fails, they throw it away and replace it with another cheap old system. And if the computing power is not sufficient, they'll add one more server to the mix. Overall, the normal servers are 50,000 rupees or, maybe not 50,000, that's laptop, right? So around maybe, 2 to 5 lakh rupees for a server. You can imagine how many servers you'll get for 2 crore rupees, which is the cost of the power server of IBM. And Google networks all of them together and makes the illusion of a single large computer, which is what your textbook calls the warehouse scale computer. Okay, so that's basically called horizontal scalability. So you should be familiar with these two terms of vertical and horizontal scalability also. Any questions?
Ma'am, when we horizontally scale, ma'am, like, isn't the time to retrieve also increases as we scale more horizontally than vertically? Because we have to travel from system to system now rather than within memory or just from seeking from storage.
Yeah, which is why your data center networks are very, very important. your distributed algorithms, your data center networks, everything is very, very important. In fact, there are a lot of innovations in the Ethernet protocol for that reason only. Because what Ethernet protocol we studied is the original Ethernet protocol we studied at the most switched gigabit Ethernet. But when you go to data center networks, you will be talking minimum 40 gigabit Ethernet and 100 gigabit Ethernet. And in fact, there at that level, Ethernet also implements flow control. Okay, the data link layer. We studied about flow control at the transport layer in the TCP/IP stack. But today they are implemented at the data link layer also. So they also have very, very efficient distributed algorithms, right? So that is the power of Google's algorithms actually. Unfortunately, they don't publish all the algorithms, right? But they do publish some of them. For example, MapReduce came from them only. Okay, it is, I don't know if you people are familiar with the term at least of MapReduce. I hope you are.
Yes, ma'am. Wasn't it
Yeah,
like reverse engineered by Yahoo because Google did not release the actual source code, or was it for another one? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, MapReduce was taken to a next level by Google, and
Okay.
people came out of Google and created a company called Mapr. So, lot of innovations in distributed algorithms to speed up. How do you access data despite distributed access, right? So, I think I told you in this one that we use only storage area networks. See, there are no hard disks attached to servers anymore in any of the data centers. Right? There is nothing called a hard disk in a server in the data center. What you have are what are called as blade servers. Right? So all of them access the storage on a network, and which is a very, very fast network, which uses, earlier they used to use InfiniBand, which was a special protocol developed for SAN, but now mostly they still use only the 40 gig Ethernet or something else. A lot of different things are done to make it very smart, but I'm just saying that you should be familiar with the terms of vertical scalability versus horizontal scalability, because a lot of paradigms of computing have been changed by Google. Paradigm of networking also has been changed by the Stanford and Berkeley folks, okay, which was adopted by Google, Microsoft, and all of them. So, which anyway we don't cover, we cover in the advanced networks course. All of them use the similar principles of horizontal scalability, centralized control, distributed algorithms, and so on. Yeah, because you have time up to Friday, please do watch the ISA videos in sequence. I don't think it'll take more than 2 full hours, all of them put together. Okay, because they're very, very short and videos.
They're short, yeah. So even
I thought that was one of the best things I found for content sharing. So please do go through, because he has also explained very, very beautifully, and I think it makes a lot of things very clear. Once you see those, I would like to do only the principles that drive the internet set architecture definition. What makes processor architects design a particular set of instructions and so on. What are the considerations we take when designing internet set architectures? Now, those videos are so beautiful. I can't do better than them. I think it's worthwhile for you to go through them before you come to the next class, however. Okay.